The Yellow Sea does not separate the Korean peninsula from the world. It connects it to China 40 nautical miles to the west, to the northern limit line 7 nautical miles to the north, to the specific, accumulated weight of a conflict that was declared suspended in 1953 and has been technically unresolved at every moment since. The islands that dot the western approaches to the peninsula's coast exist in that suspension, inhabited and defended and perpetually within range of artillery positions that have been registered against them for decades. The people who live on those islands understand the geometry of their situation with the clarity of people who have never been allowed to forget it. At 6:14 a.m., the geometry expressed itself. The first artillery round impacted on the northwestern coastal area of Yeonpyeong Island at 6:14 a.m. and 7 seconds. It was followed by 11 additional impacts in the next 41 seconds. A salvo rate and dispersion pattern consistent with a multiple launch artillery system engaging a pre-registered target set from a battery position that had been surveyed and confirmed on a previous occasion. The impacts were not random. They were not ranging shots. They were on a grid that someone had prepared in advance and was now executing with the methodical precision of a fire mission that had been planned, rehearsed, and authorized before the first round left the tube. The USS Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating in the Yellow Sea 18 nautical miles southwest of Yeonpyeong had been on a combined exercise transit with the Republic of Korea Navy for 14 hours when the first round impacted. Its Combat Direction Center had been monitoring the tactical picture in the general area of the northern limit line throughout the exercise. A standard operational posture for any American surface combatant operating within potential engagement range of North Korean coastal artillery and naval assets. The watch team's radar picture at 6:14 a.m. showed no airborne contacts, no fast-moving surface contacts on approach vectors, nothing in the electromagnetic environment that had flagged as a warning in the 30 seconds before the first impact. Artillery does not show on radar until after it has been fired. By the time the round is in flight, the decision to fire has already been made, and the only remaining question is where it will land. The Combat Direction Center's automated threat detection system registered the first impact at 6:14 a.m. and 9 seconds, 2 seconds after the round struck, processing the seismic and acoustic signature that the ship's sensors had detected at their threshold distance. The second impact registered at 6:14 a.m. and 14 seconds. By the sixth impact at 6:14 a.m. and 31 seconds, the system had sufficient data to compute a round origin bearing, 017, consistent with the North Korean artillery position on the mainland coast north of the NLL, at an estimated range of approximately 23 kilometers from the impact zone. The tactical action officer had been watching the data populate since the first impact. He transmitted to the commanding officer at 6:14 a.m. and 33 seconds. 5 words: artillery fire. Yeonpyeong Island. Active. The commanding officer was in the Combat Direction Center. He had reached it from his sea cabin in 40 seconds after the first automated alert tone, and he had been processing the incoming impact data since arrival. His first 2 actions were simultaneous. He directed the ship to General Quarters and transmitted a flash priority report to 7th Fleet, Pacific Command, and the Combined Forces Command Headquarters at Camp Humphreys. The flash report contained the bearing, the estimated origin, the impact pattern data, and a single assessment line that did not require elaboration for anyone who received it. Assess DPRK artillery fire mission against Yeonpyeong Island. Continuing impacts. ROK Navy vessels in vicinity. U.S. Navy vessel 18 nautical miles southwest. The General Quarters alarm activated at 6:14 a.m. and 41 seconds. 27 seconds of decision-making between the TAO's report and the alarm. 27 seconds in which the commanding officer had assessed the situation, identified it as a live engagement rather than an accidental detonation or a false detection, and made the organizational commitment that sent every sailor aboard to their battle station. The island was visible from the ship's bridge on clear days. This was not a clear day. A low overcast had been sitting over the central Yellow Sea since before dawn, reducing visibility to approximately 4 nautical miles at the surface. The island was not visible. What was visible was the ship's surface search radar picture, which showed the ROK Navy patrol craft operating in the island's vicinity as small, fast returns moving in the specific erratic pattern of vessels that were responding to an active attack. Not transit speed, not patrol speed, but the accelerated, unpredictable movement of hulls reacting to rounds falling in their operating area. At 6:15 a.m., the artillery barrage shifted. The impact pattern on the ship's acoustic and seismic sensor picture had been concentrated in the island's northwestern coastal zone since the first round. At 6:15 a.m. and 4 seconds, new impacts registered at a different grid, further east into the island's interior residential zone. The shift was not a ranging adjustment. It was a deliberate target reallocation, the battery moving its fire mission from the coastal military infrastructure to the populated area behind it. The round count from the second target area reached 6 impacts in 18 seconds. 18 impacts total in 49 seconds. A sustained, deliberately targeted artillery engagement on a populated South Korean island in international waters contested by the NLL. The Combined Exercises ROK Navy Task Force Commander transmitted to the commanding officer at 6:15 a.m. and 12 seconds on the Joint Tactical Net. The transmission was in English, the operational language of the combined exercise, and it was brief and completely unambiguous about its content. The ROK Navy Task Force was responding to the attack. ROK ground forces on the island were returning fire from their own K9 self-propelled howitzer positions. The ROK Air Force was scrambling F-15K aircraft from Cheongju Air Base on a strike authorization hold. Authorized to launch, not yet authorized to employ weapons, pending government-level escalation authority confirmation. The ROK Navy Task Force was requesting American fire support coordination and requesting that the USS destroyer assume a fire support coordination position capable of providing naval gunfire support if and when escalation authority was granted. Fire support coordination. The specific request that moved the USS destroyer from a monitoring and reporting role into an active participant posture within the combined response architecture. The commanding officer processed the request against his rules of engagement. His rules of engagement for combined exercises with the ROK Navy included a specific provision for force protection and combined defense coordination under active attack conditions. A provision that had been negotiated, documented, and briefed to every watch team before the exercise began, and that existed precisely because the scenario it addressed was not a theoretical contingency in this particular operating area. The provision authorized the destroyer to assume a fire support coordination role and to employ its weapon systems in defense of ROK military forces and ROK territory under active attack, subject to 7th Fleet authorization for initial weapons employment. He transmitted the 7th Fleet authorization request at 6:15 a.m. and 29 seconds. The destroyer was already moving. The commanding officer had directed an increase to 26 knots on a northeasterly heading at 6:15 a.m. and 22 seconds, repositioning the ship from its exercise transit position toward a fire support geometry that placed it within effective range of the North Korean artillery battery's estimated position. The fire support geometry required the ship to close to within the 5-inch Mark 45 guns' effective surface-to-surface engagement range, a range at which the ship would also be inside the assessed engagement envelope of North Korean coastal artillery systems positioned on the mainland coast north of the NLL. Moving into range to engage meant moving into range to be engaged. The commanding officer understood this calculation with complete precision and had made his repositioning decision with complete awareness of it. At 6:16 a.m., the ROK K9 howitzers on Yeonpyeong began returning fire. The acoustic signature of outgoing rounds was distinctly different from incoming, a sharper, higher-frequency crack rather than the lower-frequency impact thud, and the ship's sensor system cataloged both categories of signature simultaneously, building a real-time picture of an active artillery exchange developing on the island 7 nautical miles to the northeast. The ROK return fire was aimed at the battery origin bearing computed from the incoming round trajectories. Whether the K9 rounds were achieving effect on the North Korean battery position was not determinable from the ship's sensor picture alone. At 6:17 a.m. and 33 seconds, the 7th Fleet authorization arrived. The transmission was classified, specific, and 17 words. USS call sign. Authorized for naval gunfire support. Combined ROK defense in accordance with current ROE. Weapons free. Weapons free. The authorization that transformed the ship from a monitoring and coordinating asset into a fire support asset with the specific capability of its 5-inch gun system available for employment against a target whose origin bearing and estimated position had been computing in the Combat Direction Center for the past 3 minutes. 3 minutes of track data. At 6 impacts per minute from the North Korean battery, 3 minutes of track data represented a significant accumulation of origin point fixes from individual round trajectories, each contributing to the probabilistic position estimate for the battery that the ship's fire control system was maintaining. The position estimate had a confidence interval that had been narrowing with each additional impact detection. By 6:17 a.m., the confidence interval was tight enough that the ship's fire control system assessed it as a valid engagement solution for naval gunfire. The 5-inch gun mount was tracking to the bearing of the origin estimate at 6:17 a.m. and 51 seconds. It fired at 6:18 a.m. and 3 seconds. The first round was aimed at a point 300 meters south of the highest confidence origin estimate. A deliberate offset that placed the first impact in a position that would confirm or refine the origin estimate against the actual battery position, without committing the full fire mission to a position fix that carried any remaining residual uncertainty. Counter-battery fire in this operational context was not a suppressive area bombardment. It was a precise, documented engagement against a specific military target that required every practical measure to minimize the engagement's impact footprint and maximize its effect on the specific military system being engaged. The spotting round's impact was registered by the ship's acoustic sensor at 6:18 a.m. and 12 seconds. The ship also registered a new data point at 6:18 a.m. and 14 seconds. The North Korean battery had not ceased firing. 2 additional impacts on Yeonpyeong registered in the 2 seconds following the spotting round's detonation on the mainland coast. The battery crew had either not identified the naval gunfire as a threat to their position, or had made the decision to continue the fire mission despite the incoming round. 2. The fire control system adjusted the engagement solution from the spotting round's impact data. The adjustment moved the solution grid 180 meters northwest, a refinement consistent with a battery position slightly further inland than the initial estimate had placed it. The adjustment was applied to the full engagement sequence. The 5-inch gun fired its second round at 6:18 a.m. and 21 seconds. Third at 6:18 a.m. and 29 seconds. Fourth at 6:18 a.m. and 37 seconds. Fifth at 6:18 a.m. and 45 seconds. The rate of fire was measured by the gun mount's cycle time and the fire control system's solution update interval between shots, not the maximum mechanical rate, but the operationally optimal rate that balanced round delivery speed against solution refinement quality. The North Korean battery fired its last detected round at 6:18 a.m. and 39 seconds. 14 seconds after the second naval gunfire round impacted in its position area. The round impacted on the island's eastern coastal zone. After 6:18 a.m. and 39 seconds, the ship's acoustic sensor registered no additional incoming impacts on the island. The battery had ceased firing. Whether it had ceased because the naval gunfire had damaged or destroyed the battery equipment because the crew had evacuated the firing position, or because the North Korean Command Authority had ordered a cessation, was not determinable from the ship's picture at 6:18 a.m. and 39 seconds. What was determinable was the result. The artillery fire on Yeonpyeong Island stopped. The destroyer ceased its fire mission at 6:19 a.m. and 7 seconds. 28 seconds after the last North Korean round impacted, 38 seconds after the last naval gunfire round was expended. The gun mount returned to its secured position. The fire control system transitioned from active engagement mode to surveillance mode. The ship reduced speed and began a repositioning maneuver that took it to a holding position 8 nautical miles west of Yeonpyeong, outside the assessed engagement envelope of additional North Korean artillery that might be brought to bear on the naval gunfire platform's identified position, while maintaining a hold position that kept the island's approaches within the gun's effective range if the fire mission resumed. The ROK F-15K section arrived over the operating area at 6:21 a.m. 2 aircraft, weapons loaded, weapons employment still on authorization hold pending government decision. They established a combat air patrol over the island and the surrounding waters that made a second North Korean air or missile strike, if one was being planned, a significantly more complex operation than the artillery mission that had preceded it. At 6:23 a.m., the last of the 89 island residents who had been in their homes when the barrage began had been confirmed as having reached the island's designated shelter facilities, hardened structures that had been built, upgraded, and maintained against exactly this scenario over the preceding years. The shelter facilities had been occupied within minutes of the first impact by residents whose emergency preparedness response had been shaped by community drills and by the specific institutional memory of a previous attack on this same island 14 years earlier, an attack that had informed every emergency infrastructure investment since. 89 residents. 89 accounted for in the shelter facilities. ROK military personnel had not all reached shelter before the barrage ended. 4 ROK soldiers on the island's northwestern observation post had been in the direct impact zone of the first target area during the first 49 seconds of the barrage. 2 had been injured by fragment strikes from impacts in their position's vicinity. Both were stable and had been evacuated by ROK military helicopter by 6:40 a.m. 2 additional ROK soldiers had been in the residential zone when the fire mission shifted eastward and had taken cover in a civilian structure that provided fragment protection, but not full blast protection. Both sustained minor injuries from secondary structural debris. Both were treated at the island's medical facility and were ambulatory. No civilian casualties from the barrage. The shelter system had worked. The North Korean battery position on the mainland coast north of the NLL had been assessed from satellite imagery by 8:30 a.m., 2 hours and 16 minutes after the final naval gunfire round was expended. The imagery showed a self-propelled artillery unit at a position consistent with the fire control system's engagement solution. The imagery also showed structural damage to associated equipment in the immediate vicinity of the battery position, and a vehicle track pattern consistent with rapid repositioning after the fire mission ceased. The battery had moved. Whether the naval gunfire had caused casualties among the crew or damage to the primary weapon system was not accessible from imagery alone at the classification level available to the after-action assessment team. The assessment documented this uncertainty with the standard language of analysts who had learned to distinguish between what could be confirmed and what could be assessed with varying confidence, and who understood that the operational community's planning requirements could be better served by precise uncertainty than by false confidence. The after-action debrief at the Combined Forces Command Headquarters lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. The United States Navy component's contribution to the debrief produced findings that were organized under 3 categories. The first category was operational effectiveness. The response from first impact detection to 7th Fleet weapons authorization had taken 3 minutes and 26 seconds. The fire mission had commenced 46 seconds after authorization and had lasted 73 seconds over 5 rounds plus 1 spotting round. The North Korean battery had ceased fire 14 seconds after the second engagement round impacted in its position area. A total of 60 seconds from first naval gunfire impact to cessation of incoming fire on the island. The repositioning maneuver to the post-engagement holding position had been completed within 11 minutes of the last round, placing the ship outside the assessed threat envelope before any North Korean counter-battery response could have been organized against the ship's firing position. The second category was combined operations coordination. The exercise had produced a practical demonstration of the combined response architecture that had been built, refined, and exercised between American and ROK forces for decades. A demonstration conducted under live engagement conditions with real civilian and military personnel at risk, the outcomes of which reflected the quality of the planning and preparation that preceded it. The speed of the authority transmission from ROK Task Force Commander to USS Commanding Officer to 7th Fleet and back had been within the benchmarks established in the Combined Exercise Planning documents. The ROK F-15K arrival time was within the standard response window for aircraft scrambling from Cheongju under the current basing and alert posture. The third category was intelligence and operational learning, and it was the category that produced the most annotation in the margins of the copies that circulated through the commands that received the assessment. The North Korean battery had fired 23 rounds in 65 seconds before ceasing. The rate, the pattern, and the target shift sequence were consistent with a fire mission that had been planned against a pre-registered target set, not an improvised engagement responding to a developing tactical situation, but a scripted operation executing a prepared plan. The shift from the coastal military infrastructure to the residential zone at 6:15 a.m. and 4 seconds had occurred with a timing precision that was consistent with a pre-planned phase transition rather than a battlefield adjustment to observed effects. The battery had been executing a mission brief, not reacting to circumstances. A pre-planned fire mission against a South Korean island executed during a combined US-ROK military exercise, at a time of day when the exercise was in its standard overnight transit phase and American surface assets were in a position that the North Korean planning apparatus had presumably assessed from monitoring the exercise schedule. The timing correlation between the exercise profile and the attack timing was documented in the intelligence annex of the after-action report, with the same analytical precision that the operational findings had been documented, and with the same institutional caution about distinguishing confirmed correlation from confirmed intent. The fourth finding, the one that traveled highest and fastest through the distribution chain, was the shelter system's performance. 89 civilians in shelter facilities with 0 civilian casualties from a 23-round barrage concentrated in part on a residential zone. The preparedness infrastructure that had been built on this island since the previous attack 14 years ago had performed at or above its design parameters. The finding was documented as a combined civilian-military success and was transmitted to Pacific Command, to the Combined Forces Command, and, through the appropriate diplomatic channel, to the ROK Government's Civil Defense Planning Office. Outside the debrief room, the Yellow Sea was running at standard state under an overcast that had not changed since before dawn. The island was visible from the Combined Forces Command facility on the mainland, 11 nautical miles south of the NLL, as a low shape on the gray water with a visible column of smoke rising from the northwestern coastal zone where the fire mission had concentrated its first target phase. The smoke was from structural fires that ROK fire response teams had controlled but not yet fully extinguished. It was visible for a long time. The destroyer was at its holding position. Its crew was standing down from general quarters to the elevated readiness posture that would persist until the intelligence picture resolved the North Korean battery's current disposition, and the diplomatic and political response processes produced a framework for what came next. The gun mount was secure. The ammunition count was 6 rounds reduced from the pre-engagement inventory. 6 rounds. 1 spotting round and 5 fire mission rounds. An expenditure that represented, in the arithmetic of naval gunfire support, a specific and limited contribution to a response that was primarily being carried by ROK ground forces, ROK artillery, ROK air power, and the emergency infrastructure that kept 89 civilians alive during 23 incoming rounds. The ship was part of that response. It was not the whole of it. The whole of it was a system, built over decades, funded through difficult budget cycles, maintained through years of exercises in conditions that included the specific exercise the ship had been executing when the first round impacted at 6:14 a.m. A system that had been tested today under live conditions and had performed. The Yellow Sea does not keep score. It does not record the rounds that fell on it, the ships that transited it, or the people who crossed it in helicopters at 6:40 a.m., evacuating soldiers from an island that had been inside a threat envelope since before their parents were born. The Yellow Sea simply continues, flat, gray, and connecting everything to everything else with the indifferent geography of a body of water that has been the staging ground for human consequences since long before any of its current claimants arrived. The ship was there. The system held. The count was the same in the evening as it had been before dawn. That is the answer the Yellow Sea demands, and the answer that was given. It will be given again the next time it is demanded by the people who go there because someone has to, and who come back because the system worked. The line holds where the people hold it. In the Yellow Sea, that has always been the only way it holds.